So in this sample, we'll be exploring zippers, and when we're finished, we'll have done a center-placed zipper sample. But there's many different ways to sew in a zipper, as well as many different types of zippers. So this one right here is an example of just a regular polyester or plastic zipper with a coil tooth. You see how it's a little kind of rounded edge, as opposed to something like this, which is actually a kind of more rectilinear plastic tooth. And this is what's called a separating zipper. You've met this probably in your winter jackets or anything that you have to step in and out of. I also have a sample here of a metal zipper. Also happens to be separating because it comes apart entirely. But the ones that we tend to work with in clothing often are these plastic coil-bound zippers that have a stop on the end. And so they're really meant to be trapped in a seam. So some terms I want you to write down is that you have your zipper pull, which is the thing that you hold on to actually open and close the zipper. A zipper stop, which is a little plastic or metal piece that covers the zipper and makes it so that you can't go past a certain point. The zipper teeth are what get zipped together and interlocked to create the zipper and to close it up. You also have these little stops at the very top that keep the zipper head from pulling off. And then you have some seam allowance. And this will get trapped in the seam allowance of your garment. Often these will get put into the center back of a dress or a garment or into a side seam. And this is the most prevalent piece that we'll usually use for costume quick changes and things like that. This is a sample of an invisible zipper. And so you can see how from the front side, you can't really see anything other than fabric. But if you flip it over on the underside, that's where you have all of the zipper teeth. And this one's been made so that when those zipper teeth get bound together, they curl inwards. And so we'll often see this in women's wear. The invisible zippers are meant to be that once they're in a seam, it just looks like the seam is stitched. And the only thing that gives away the zipper is this little zipper head at the very top. We don't like these for theater because they tend to pop. Out of any of the zippers on this table, the invisible zip is something that will go catawampus in a quick change because they tend to not respond well to force. Whereas if we are working in a period costume, when we can hide a huge honking zipper like this one, we will use a heavier grade zipper to withstand the repeat of in and out that quick changes will need. So for this sample today, you will take a small 7-inch long polyester zipper. You'll have one piece of 6x8 fabric, and then your ruler, a marking pencil, and some pins. So the first thing we'll do is just cut our fabric in half. And the fastest way to do that is to give a little pinch so that you can find the halfway point, clip, and then tear, and you can neaten up your edges. Since we've torn this apart, we know that it's actually the same distance on either side of these tears. So I'm going to prep what will become my zipper seam by lining up my edges and marking 5/8 on it with my ruler. So now that I have 5/8, this will eventually become my seam, but not all the seam is going to be stitched. Part of it will be the distance for my zipper. So to prep this seam, I'm going to use the length of my zipper to tell me when the seam will be used for zipper and when it will be continued onwards for the rest of the garment. So taking my zipper and lining it up on my stitch line and lining up my little cut edge of my zipper with the top edge of my fabric, I'm looking for where this zipper stop is. So once I can find that zipper stop, I'll mark on my stitch line, because basically my next step will be to machine baste this section and to machine stitch this section. So then that way I can have a nice clean line on which to place my zipper. But when I take it out, I'll still have the seam line for the rest of the garment. And now I can pin my seam just like my plain seam, where I have my right sides touching of my fabric. My edges are all lined up, and I'll pin one end and then pin my other. So for this first part, we'll be doing a machine based on the zipper opening. So it's still a straight stitch, so we want our zigzag to stay at 0. Then we'll move our stitch length down to 5. So we'll place our zipper lining up the stitch line with that cut on our presser foot. And because we are machine basting, we will not backstitch when we start. We'll go down the line and then we'll stop basting when we hit this point that marked our zipper ending. And now that I've gotten to the point where my zipper will end, I'm going to change my stitch length to 3 so that I can continue on with the stay stitching of the last little bit of the seam. And then I will backstitch and then run off the end almost and backstitch to finish that seam. Because we did our machine based and then our machine stay stitching all in one go, there's one step you have to do before you continue, and that is to find the last basted stitch in this row before your back stitching happens, and you're just going to go ahead and cut that. So on both sides, you're going to find that last stitch and just slice it with your seam ripper. So then that way, when you get to your last step, which is opening up your basted seam to reveal the zipper, this little stitch isn't going to fight you. Now that you have that cut, you can go ahead and press it open just like you would a plain seam. So making sure your fabric is as flush to the table as possible. You'll just press that open. And then you will leave these tails on so that way you have something to hold on to when you go to pull out your basting stitch. And now we're ready to actually place the zipper. Now remember, we're looking at the inside of the garment. This is the right side. So at the end of the day, the zipper is going to have to be revealed this way, right? So that when we open up this seam, the zipper pull is facing us. So you have to make sure that you keep that in mind when you're placing your zipper. So as counterintuitive as it feels, when you're pinning your zipper in place, you should not be able to see your zipper pull. Make sure the zipper is facing away from you and touching the seam allowance. So to place it, you're going to line it up basically with that stitch line. So for me, the stitch line is right at the edge of this burgundy stripe. So I'm centering my zipper on that burgundy stripe, and I'm going to walk the zipper down. So basically I'll pin this first one, and I'll just pin through all layers. And so I'm pinning through the fabric, wrapping around the bulk of the zipper, and then coming through. This is just us placing it because we will actually hand baste this in before we go to stitch it. And then you can peel back your zipper so that you can see your zipper, and you're making sure that you are lining it up on your stitch line. And then every couple of inches, I'll pin it in place. And then these two little flanges, I'm going to pin nice and straight on the top, rather than letting them poke outwards. Because as you investigate your own zippers, what you'll find is that there's actually a stitch line on the zipper itself. It's kind of a difference in how it gets woven. So mine is about halfway in the middle of this side of the zipper tape, or 1/8 of an inch away from my zipper. Our next step will be to diagonally baste this into place. An experienced stitcher could go ahead and just stitch it with these pins, but as someone who's learning, these might get in your way. So we're actually what's going to do called a diagonal baste. And so a baste, just like on the machine, is a temporary longer stitch, but a diagonal baste actually stitches one direction while moving the other, and that's a way to keep our tape in place from moving in any direction. So threading your needle with a long piece of thread and then pulled double so you have your tail ends matching. And don't worry about knotting this because this is also going to be a temporary stitch. So starting on either side, I'm just going to take about a 1/4 inch stitch through the zipper tape and the fabric, and I'll leave a relatively long tail on there so it won't pull out. And then I'll take an extra stitch just to keep it in place, and that's just a temporary back stitch. So I can pull that pin out because I no longer need it. But now I'll move down the line about a 1/2 inch and I'll take another stitch horizontally. And so even though I'm stitching horizontally, you guys will see this diagonal stitch travel from one stitch to the next. And I'm keeping my fingers behind my work so that it doesn't bubble. But I'm just going to do these 1/4 inch wide stitches so that on the side that I'm working, I only see these traveling stitches. But if I were to flip this over, I have these bar-like horizontal stitches, which is the stitches that I'm actually taking. And once I complete one side, then I'll move over to the next side and I'll do the same thing up on that end. Just taking my stitches and moving upwards, removing those pins as I go. And as I finish, just putting in one more back stitch just to help hold those little legs in place. Now before we stitch in our zipper, we'll have to remove our regular foot that we used before and put on the zipper foot that you guys last used with the corded seam. And in this case, we're also going to move over our needle placement all the way to the left, so then that way our needle will clear the foot and not smash into it. So now we're ready to stitch our zipper. So we can line up the left side edge of our zipper foot with that line that's down the middle of our zipper tape, or you can use the right side of the foot and line it up with the outside edge of your zipper tape, depending on how it's marked. But from now, I'm just going to stitch it like I did a plain seam, where I will backstitch, I will work all the way around down the line and make a box around this zipper. And now I'm coming up on where my zipper stop is. So I'm going to take one more stitch so then that way I will live right across from it. And I want you to channel that chapter 3 road test where you left your needle in the fabric or paper, you lift up the presser foot and then you pivot. And we're just going to stitch right over top of our zipper. As a plastic coil zipper, this is not going to be a problem. There's not going to be a reason for it to get smashed, unless you go a little bit too far and you stitch over top of the metal zipper stop on the bottom. So we're just trying to capture the zipper just above that zipper stop. And then you stitch until you hit that stitch line on your zipper tape, and then you can pivot one more time, and then you'll just repeat your stitch all the way up that side of the zipper. So now that we've stitched this box around our zipper, you can see from the right side we have a box that goes all the way around this seam, but on the wrong side we kind of have a cluster of different threads. So the first thing I'll do is take out those diagonal bastes with my seam ripper, cutting threads as I need. Though ideally you can use your seam ripper just to kind of pull out the threads, and then as they get long you can kind of give them a clip so that you're not trying to drag your entire stitch length through your basting. And then the next step is to go ahead and pull out the basting that's holding this seam together. So I can find those threads again, and then I can give them a pull. And since I trimmed that last baste in that seam, this is why, so that you should be able to just pull along the line, much like you were gathering and basting. And if I hadn't cut that basting stitch, then this wouldn't be possible. And if you didn't get it all in one go, just go ahead and clean that up. So then that way your seam can be fully opened. And then of course our last tip, or you can do this at any point, is just to trim your thread tails from your stay stitch. I waited because I didn't want to accidentally trim the wrong ones. And then your last thing to do is just to test your zipper. Sometimes if you sew too close to the folded edge, the zipper teeth get compromised and they won't let the zipper head pass and open. So the last thing you want to do is just test that it'll open and shut and make some music. And that's the sound of success.